The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of First Capital Bank, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. For most people, it was just another Monday, the beginning of a work week filled with routine tasks and mundane responsibilities. But for Eliza Johnson, this particular Monday would become a defining moment in her life, though she didn't know it yet. Eliza checked her watch as she joined the queue at the bank. At 9:15 a.m., she had exactly 45 minutes before her meeting with potential investors for her community education startup. After 15 years as a high school principal in one of the city's most underfunded districts, Eliza had decided to channel her passion for education into something bigger, a network of after-school learning centers for children from low-income families. But next, please. Eliza stepped forward, her portfolio clutched tightly against her cream-colored blazer. The teller, a thin man with a permanent frown etched into his face, barely looked up as she approached. "Good morning," Eliza said, her voice warm and confident. "I need to make a withdrawal from my business account." She slid her identification card and account details across the counter. The teller, whose name tag read Richard, glanced briefly at her documents before his eyes flicked back to his computer screen. His fingers moved lazily across the keyboard. "This is a premium business account," he said, emphasizing the word premium with unmistakable skepticism. "There seems to be some mistake." Eliza's smile remained steady. "There's no mistake. I opened that account last month for my education startup." Richard's eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. "These accounts are typically for established businesses." The pause before established hung in the air like a bad odor. "My business is established," Eliza replied evenly. "I've submitted all the required documentation." His fingers tapped a few more keys. "It says here you're requesting a withdrawal of $15,000. The volume of his voice rose deliberately, causing several heads to turn in their direction. "That's correct," Eliza said, lowering her own voice in contrast. "As I mentioned, it's for my business." "And what business would that be?" Richard asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Education. I'm meeting with investors this morning." Richard let out a small, derisive laugh. "Education. Right." He turned to his colleague at the next window, not bothering to lower his voice. "She wants to withdraw 15 grand for education." He made air quotes around the word. The flush of embarrassment that crept up Eliza's neck was quickly replaced by something else, a familiar heat that had fueled her through years of being underestimated. She straightened her back, her 5'4" frame suddenly seeming taller. "Is there a problem with my account?" she asked, her voice firm but controlled. "Let me check with my manager," Richard replied with exaggerated patience, the kind reserved for children or those deemed incapable of understanding simple concepts. "But we need to verify certain, unusual transactions." As Richard walked away with deliberate slowness, Eliza remained standing at the counter, aware of the stares from other customers. The word unusual echoed in her mind, its implication clear in the context of Richard's behavior. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The line behind Eliza grew longer, murmurs of impatience spreading among the waiting customers. Richard was nowhere to be seen, though Eliza occasionally caught glimpses of him chatting with colleagues, glancing in her direction with what appeared to be amusement. At 15 minutes, Eliza checked her watch again. 9:30 a.m. Her meeting was at 10 a.m. across town. The knot in her stomach tightened. "Excuse me," she called to another teller. "I've been waiting for quite some time. My transaction is time-sensitive." The young woman looked uncomfortable. "Richard is speaking with the manager. I'm sure he'll be back soon." Just as Eliza was about to respond, Richard reappeared, walking unhurriedly toward his window. He sat down and began organizing papers on his desk, still not acknowledging her presence. "Excuse me," Eliza said, her patience wearing thin. "I've been waiting for 15 minutes. As I mentioned, I have an important meeting." Richard looked up with feigned surprise. "Oh, yes. Well, there seems to be an issue with your account verification. The system is flagging it as a potential security risk." But A security risk, Eliza repeated, disbelief evident in her voice. I provided all my identification. I've been a customer of this bank for over 20 years. Yes, but this particular account is new, Richard replied smoothly. And withdrawals of this size from new accounts require additional scrutiny. It's bank policy. I was not informed of any such policy when I opened the account, Eliza said. And I find it interesting that this additional scrutiny involves you leaving me standing here while you chat with your colleagues. Richard's false smile slipped momentarily, but I was consulting with my manager, Ms. Johnson. If you're in such a rush, perhaps you should have come earlier or planned your finances better. The bank lobby seemed to grow quieter. Even the security guard by the door had stopped his casual conversation with a customer to observe the exchange. I planned my finances perfectly well, Eliza replied, her voice low but clear. What I didn't plan for was encountering prejudice at my own bank this morning. Richard's face flushed. Prejudice? I'm simply following protocol. Not everything is about race, Ms. Johnson. Interesting that you immediately assumed I was referring to racial prejudice, Richard, Eliza responded. Though your behavior certainly suggests that's a factor. A woman in line behind Eliza cleared her throat awkwardly. Others pretended sudden interest in their phones or the bank's promotional posters. I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice, Richard said, his own voice rising. You're causing a disturbance. The only disturbance here is the blatant disrespect I'm receiving as a customer, Eliza replied. Now, I would like to speak with your manager, not have you consult with them out of my presence, and I would like to make my withdrawal. I have a meeting with investors who, unlike you, recognize the value of education in underserved communities. Richard's jaw tightened. Fine, wait here. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. No, Eliza said firmly. I've waited long enough. I'll come with you. Customers aren't allowed. I'm sure your manager would be interested to know you've kept me waiting for nearly 20 minutes while you discussed my transaction with everyone except me. The standoff lasted only seconds, but to those watching, it felt much longer. Finally, Richard turned without another word and walked toward a door marked staff only. Eliza followed, aware of the eyes tracking her movement across the lobby. Behind the door was a short corridor leading to several offices. Richard knocked on one door labeled branch manager and entered without waiting for a response. Eliza followed close behind. Mr. Davis, this is the customer I was telling you about, Richard began, his tone suggesting he was dealing with a particularly difficult situation. She's insisting on making a large withdrawal from a new business account, and she's been quite disruptive. The manager, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, looked up from his computer screen. His eyes moved from Richard to Eliza, then back to Richard. Thank you, Richard. I'll handle this. The dismissal was clear, but Richard hesitated. Sir, as I was explaining, the system flagged. Thank you, Richard, Mr. Davis repeated, more firmly this time. Please return to your window. There are customers waiting. With obvious reluctance, Richard left the office, closing the door with unnecessary force. Please have a seat, Ms. Johnson. Eliza Johnson, she supplied, remaining standing. Mr. Davis, I don't have time to sit. I've already spent 20 minutes being humiliated and obstructed by your employee. I need to make a withdrawal from my business account and get to my meeting. Mr. Davis removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. But I apologize for any inconvenience, Ms. Johnson. Richard mentioned some verification issues with your account. There are no verification issues with my account, Eliza said flatly. I opened a premium business account last month with all proper documentation. I'm attempting to withdraw $15,000 for a meeting with investors for my education startup, which focuses on providing after-school learning centers in underserved communities. She placed her portfolio on his desk and extracted several documents, laying them neatly in front of him. Here is my ID, my account information. And my business plan, which your small business banking department reviewed and approved when I opened the account. The only issue seems to be Richard's disbelief that someone who looks like me could possibly have a legitimate business requiring such a withdrawal. Mr. Davis's expression was unreadable as he reviewed the documents. After a moment, he looked up. Everything appears to be in order, Ms. Johnson. He checked his computer. And yes, I can see that your account was fully verified when it was opened. He sighed. I apologize for the confusion and for any inappropriate behavior from our staff. It wasn't confusion, Mr. Davis. It was deliberate obstruction and public humiliation, Eliza replied. And while I appreciate your apology, it doesn't address the larger issue. This isn't the first time I've encountered such treatment, though I expected better from an institution that holds my money and claims to support small businesses. She checked her watch again. 9:40 a.m. Now, I need to make that withdrawal immediately if I'm to make my meeting on time. Mr. Davis nodded, standing up. Of course. I'll process this myself. Please, come with me. They exited the office together, walking back into the main lobby. The atmosphere was tense, customers and employees alike watching with barely concealed interest as Eliza and the manager approached the teller windows. Richard was serving another customer but looked up as they passed, his expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Mr. Davis led Eliza to an empty window and began processing her withdrawal himself. As he counted out the cash, Eliza became aware of how quiet the bank had become. Conversations had dwindled to whispers. The usual sounds of printers and keyboards seemed muted. Here you are, Ms. Johnson, Mr. Davis said, presenting her with an envelope containing her withdrawal along with a receipt. Again, I apologize for the delay and any misunderstanding. Eliza accepted the envelope, placing it securely in her portfolio. Under normal circumstances, she would have thanked him and left. But these weren't normal circumstances. The weight of what had just happened, what happened to her, regularly pressed down on her, demanding acknowledgement. She turned, facing the lobby. Dozens of eyes quickly averted their gaze, suddenly finding interest in deposit slips and cell phone screens. But Eliza had spent 15 years commanding the attention of distracted teenagers. She knew how to make herself heard. I'd like to say something, she announced, her voice carrying across the marble floor. It wasn't a shout, but its clarity and conviction demanded attention. Heads turned. The security guard straightened. Many of you witnessed what happened here today, Eliza continued. A simple banking transaction turned into a public spectacle because someone decided, based on nothing but appearance, that I couldn't possibly be who I claimed to be: a business owner, an educator, a person worthy of basic respect. She paused, meeting the eyes of those watching. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious. A few nodded almost imperceptibly. What you may not have witnessed before are the 1,000 little moments like this that make up the lives of people who look like me. The extra questions, the heightened scrutiny, the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle suggestions that we don't belong in certain spaces or deserve certain services. Richard had stopped his transaction, frozen in place as Eliza spoke. Mr. Davis stood nearby, making no attempt to interrupt her. I'm not sharing this to make anyone feel guilty or uncomfortable. I'm sharing it because awareness is the first step toward change. And because I want everyone in this room to know exactly who I am and what I'm doing with this money that was so suspicious when in my hands. Eliza opened her portfolio and extracted a brochure, holding it up for all to see. On its cover was the logo for BrightPath Learning Centers alongside an image of diverse children engaged in various educational activities. My name is Eliza Johnson. I was a high school principal in this city for 15 years, working in a district where the graduation rate was just 62% when I started. When I left last year, it was 89%. Now, I'm creating a network of after-school learning centers that will provide tutoring, mentorship, and enrichment programs for children from low-income families. She took a step forward, her voice growing stronger. The $15,000 I'm withdrawing today, it's to secure a lease on our first location in the eastern part of the city, where educational resources are scarce. I'm meeting with investors who believe in this vision, investors who see value where others see only risk. The silence in the bank was absolute now. Even the usual electronic hums of equipment seemed to have faded into the background. We all have biases, Eliza continued, her tone softening slightly. They're the shortcuts our brains take based on what we've been taught explicitly or implicitly throughout our lives. But when those biases affect how we treat others, when they cause us to humiliate someone publicly, to question their legitimacy, and to waste their time because we've already decided they don't matter, that's when bias becomes harmful. She turned slightly, her gaze finding Richard, who was staring fixedly at his computer screen. I don't know what assumptions led to my treatment today. Perhaps it was the color of my skin. Perhaps it was my gender. Perhaps it was something else entirely. What I do know is that it was wrong, and it's part of a pattern that affects too many people every day in ways large and small. Eliza closed her portfolio and took a deep breath. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the same respect and consideration given to anyone else. And I'm asking each of you to consider how your actions, conscious or unconscious, might affect others who are simply trying to live their lives, run their businesses, or in my case, make a difference in the community we all share. The final words hung in the air, resonating in the stillness of the lobby. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, from somewhere in the back of the queue, a slow, deliberate clap began. It was joined by another, then another, building into a wave of applause that spread across the bank. An elderly woman stepped out of line and approached Eliza. I'd like to know more about your learning centers, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. My grandson struggles in school, and there's nothing like this in our neighborhood. I'll be happy to tell you about it, Eliza replied, reaching into her portfolio for a business card. Our first center opens next month. As the applause subsided, more people came forward, some offering encouragement, others inquiring about the program, a few sharing their own stories of similar experiences. Mr. Davis stood to the side, watching with an expression that mingled surprise with something that might have been respect. Eliza checked her watch one final time. 9:50 a.m. She would have to hurry to make her meeting, but somehow the urgency felt different now. What had happened in the bank, uncomfortable as it was, had reinforced exactly why her work mattered, why creating spaces where all children felt valued and capable was so essential. As she made her way to the exit, portfolio tucked securely under her arm and contact information exchanged with several interested community members, Mr. Davis approached her. Ms. Johnson, he began, his voice lower now, but I want to apologize again for your experience today. It was unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed. Eliza nodded. I appreciate that, Mr. Davis. But more than an apology, I'd like to see real change. Not just for me, but for everyone who walks through those doors. I understand, he replied, and for the first time since their interaction began, Eliza sensed genuine sincerity. Would you consider coming back to speak to our staff about your experience? As part of our community engagement and diversity training? The request surprised her. It wasn't what she'd expected. I'm not interested in being a token diversity speaker, Mr. Davis. That's not what I'm suggesting, he said quickly. Your background in education, your business experience, and yes, your perspective as a black woman in these spaces, all of it, would be valuable. We have programs where we partner with local businesses, offer financial literacy workshops. Perhaps there's a way we could support your learning centers while also learning from you. Eliza considered the offer. It wasn't perfect, but it was a starting point, an acknowledgement that change was necessary and possible. I'll think about it, she said finally. For now, I need to get to my meeting. Of course. Mr. Davis handed her a business card. My direct line is on there. An Ms. Johnson? Good luck with your investors. What you're doing, it matters. Outside, the morning air felt crisp and clarifying. Eliza hailed a taxi, giving the driver the address of the investment firm. As the car pulled away from the curb, she looked back at the bank, its imposing stone facade and gleaming windows suddenly seeming less intimidating than they had an hour ago. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her former colleague, Marcus, who had arranged the meeting with investors. "They're running 15 minutes late. Traffic downtown. Everything okay on your end?" Eliza smiled. "Perfect timing." She texted back, "All good. See you soon." The taxi merged into the flow of traffic, and Eliza used the unexpected extra time to gather her thoughts. The confrontation at the bank had shaken her, yes, but it had also crystallized the importance of her mission. Every child deserved to be seen for their potential, not judged by preconceptions or limited by circumstances. Every person deserved that basic dignity. But as the city landscape flowed past her window, Eliza reflected on how a moment of humiliation had transformed into something powerful not just for her, but perhaps for everyone who had witnessed it. Real change happened in such moments, when the invisible was made visible, when silence gave way to truth spoken aloud. The taxi pulled up outside a sleek office building in the financial district. Eliza paid the driver and stepped out, straightening her blazer and squaring her shoulders. The portfolio containing her business plan, the withdrawal that had caused such a stir, and the future of BrightPath Learning Centers felt solid and certain in her hands. Inside, Marcus was waiting in the lobby. "There she is," he said warmly, coming forward to greet her. "The future of education in this city." "Dad." Eliza smiled, her confidence renewed. "But not just the future," she corrected him. "The change that's already beginning." As they rode the elevator to the meeting room where the investors waited, Marcus noticed something different about his friend and former colleague. "You look like you've already won them over," he commented. "Let's just say I've had some practice making my case today," Eliza replied. The elevator doors opened to reveal a conference room where 5 people sat around a polished table, conversation pausing as she entered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, "I'd like to introduce you to Eliza Johnson, founder of BrightPath Learning Centers and the most transformative educator I've ever had the privilege to work with." Eliza stepped forward, extending her hand to the first investor. Her voice was strong, clear, and unapologetic as she began, "Thank you for this opportunity. I'm here today because I believe that education is not just about learning, it's about being seen, being heard, and being valued for exactly who you are." And in that moment, as she prepared to share her vision for a more equitable future, Eliza knew that what had happened at the bank wasn't just an obstacle she'd overcome, it was part of the very story that made her work necessary. But it was a reminder that changing minds was just as important as building buildings, that confronting bias was as essential as creating curriculum. It was, in its own way, the most convincing argument she could make to these investors about why BrightPath Learning Centers needed to exist and why she was exactly the right person to bring them into being.